All right. Sridhar, Jonathan, Amelia, thanks for joining. I've got good news and bad news. The good news is we're really the final act of the day. The bad news is we're all that separates this crowd from the drinks and closing remarks from Annabelle and Alexandra afterwards. So please stick around. But we are here to talk about the risks and controls. So really the hand-wringing stuff that's been a kind of a side dish all day, and now is the main course. And look, the day's ending. We're going to have to keep it spicy. So I'm gonna pull the pin from some grenades. Let's start by talking about OpenAI. We've just come from this incredible week of drama and consternation at the biggest and brightest of these AI companies. Amelia, let's start with you. What can we learn about the questions around safety and responsible governance of these powerful AI systems from the drama at OpenAI?
Yeah, so I think what we saw unfold this week was the reason we need regulation at the federal level. Because there's long been a narrative that self-governance is sufficient to be able to regulate when we think about concerns about safety of these systems or readiness of these systems to be deployed in the real-world settings. And what we saw is that's insufficient. We can't rely on not-for-profit boards, for-profit boards, safety engineering teams, or scientists within these organizations to make the decisions around, is a system safe or is it ready to be deployed, especially when you consider the context of the incentive structures that are around these companies and just the amount of financial pressure that they're under, the amount of competitive pressure that they're under with many systems entering the game, and then the consequences that are at stake here from a societal perspective that once the genie's out of the bottle, it's out of the bottle.
Jonathan, Cohere is focused on bringing AI into the enterprise. I imagine you're dealing with a lot of these issues around responsible and ethical deployment. So what did the OpenAI drama mean to you, and what do you take from it?
Well, look, OpenAI is a competitor of Cohere's.
Great, so you can talk with the band.
I'll keep it a little high level, but for me, at Cohere, we talk about being enterprise-focused. And so we are a good fit for enterprises who are looking for a partner who cares about what they care about. And there's a lot of different perspectives on where this technology is today, where it's heading, where we should be focused, how we should think about responsible deployment. And for us, as all this unfolds, it reinforces for us that, listen, we're focused on being a good partner to enterprises. And we believe there are enterprises who will see that and will see a partner that has the same values that they have. And there are a lot of different types of folks with different beliefs in this system and in this ecosystem, and we're sort of seeing that come to the fore.
Okay, and Sridhar, I'll give you an opportunity to answer, but I want to say I've known Sridhar for a while. He spent years at Google building the ad business, now as an executive at Snowflake, and still a partner at Greylock?
Still a partner at Greylock.
So you've seen it all when it comes to kind of both responsible governance and the commercial imperative to deploy quickly. So what were you thinking as you saw this extraordinary set of circumstances take place at OpenAI?
I mean, at one level, it's actually a positive that there are people that are willing to raise questions about this and that there was drama and debate. It means that people take this question seriously. It's easy to call for regulation, but most regulation passed recently, like GDPR, has strictly made incumbents stronger. And so regulation that says things like there are just going to be 3 model makers in the world is actually also a bad outcome. So I think it's a pretty tricky area to navigate. And I personally think that we are quite far away from something like AGI. And yes, there is a lot of things that we have to do to make sure that when we use language models, things like the output from the models are believable, that they are creating value, that they don't have all of the biases that society has and end up codifying it into these models. So I think there's good work to be done, but I personally think that the discussions with OpenAI, the drama around it, says people care. It's a good thing. There's going to be more debate about these topics.
Amelia was addressing the governance model. OpenAI had a nonprofit board,
right,
but they clearly had another set of stakeholders, the investors, who are obviously, competitive and want to see return on investment. How unrealistic do you think that arrangement was, and what is the proper, way to balance these two competing objectives: safe development, but succeeding in the marketplace? We'll start with you. We'll go back.
Yeah, I think I'm not an expert on the structure of OpenAI. It's like what I learned about the structure similar was mostly from last week. As I said, these questions are hard. Just like there is general acceptance about the kind of safety training that you need to do for these models before they're put out into the real world. And we care a lot about this at Snowflake, where I work now, in terms of bringing responsible models into an enterprise setting. I think there needs to be an amount of discussion and cooperation with the number of companies that are out there creating models for what constitutes like safe use. I don't think there's like a single one-shot-fits-all kind of answer.
Yeah.
And as we think of what safe use looks like, we can talk about it with this like high level, what is the future of AI? And like, are we headed for robot overlords? And like, is that the future? And that can almost distract from what's actually in front of us, which is institutions, financial institutions, and other types of organizations that are deploying this technology and are deploying this technology today. And when you think about safe use of this technology, you have to evaluate on a use case basis. What is the application? What are the risks of this given application? How do we evaluate that and test that over time? And there's a risk if we just talk too much about these sort of sci-fi questions that exist with this technology that we lose sight of the very practical ramifications that are not a year out or 3 years out or 10 years out or 20 years out, but are like here today.
Yeah, I mean, so part of what appears to have been motivating some of the drama at OpenAI is not really long-term futuristic hypothetical problems, but developments, breakthroughs that some of the researchers had been making. Q-star is the one that we're hearing a lot about, even though we don't quite understand it yet. So, Amelia, like, what do you see as kind of the optimum governance paradigm right now to responsibly implement some of these findings?
Yeah. So I think it is an all of the above approach when we think about, there's so many different dimensions in which to think about AI safety from a risk-based approach, both at the level of the model and also at the level of the application. And there's also many ways to think about sort of the safety in the most strict sense of AI safety, but also the ethical piece of it as well, which are conundrums that we're dealing with today and are only going to scale as these systems scale and societal adoption of these systems sort of reaches a critical level of uptake. I also hear the point on regulation needing to be smart regulation. And I think that we need to be very careful of regulatory capture in this as we think towards designing this. And so I think there's a public conversation that needs to happen, and also engagement of industry and private sector that are not just the AI companies, but other companies that are going to be users of this technology. When we see that the most people at the seats of the table on both sides of the Atlantic on the policy side are the architects of this model, that should raise some alarm bells as we think towards what kind of regulation are we going to design? Is it actually going to solve the problems we think it's going to solve?
I remember your organization was one of the ones who put their names, your name, on these requests for pauses, right? It was a six month pause in AI development. Obviously, that might have been more of a statement than a practicality. But at this point, are you still advocating for something of a pause? And yeah, is that realistic?
Yeah. So the intent behind the pause letter was to highlight the urgency of what needs to happen. Exactly as you say, there are breakthroughs that are concerning folks on the sort of architecting side that we definitely need to pay attention to. And given how quickly this field is moving, we are not catching up the way we need to. When we think of the regulations that need to be passed, and even thinking through how do we want to deploy these technologies in society. And while we're super encouraged that since our letter, there's been this robust policy conversation, we've seen the Insight Forum, we've seen the executive order come out, there still really isn't law that's been passed, right? And we need to keep an eye on that in the sense that it's great to have these conversations, but at some point you need to get it over the finish line.
And Jonathan, do you view a pause as something practical or that Cohere would advocate for?
So I think we haven't seen uptake on the pause. We're talking about supposed breakthroughs, but we don't even know what it is that we're talking about. And so I think like we need to do is disentangle rumor and sci-fi and this like hypothetical future from like actually what the facts on the ground are. And to the point that has been made by both folks beside me, we need like responsible, thoughtful regulation in this space rather than just like jumping in one way or another because we're afraid of what might come. And I think historically we've often thought technology was going to be something that it isn't. And while that doesn't mean that it can't happen in the future, it's a good lesson for us to learn about ourselves as human beings and how we engage with technology that advances.
Yes, so throw out a couple of ideas, like what is responsible legislation that doesn't reflect regulatory capture by the industry leaders? What does that look like?
So I think we need to be focused on use cases and how this technology is actually deployed. And so an application in the back office of a financial institution where you're summarizing, let's say, internal calls for people after the call. That has very different ramifications from a automated agent that engages with clients, that can transfer money between accounts, that can answer questions. So we need to think about the different ways that this technology is deployed, and different industries also have very different ramifications. And so I think it's almost the wrong conversation if we say, how do we just regulate all of AI? Like, if only it were that easy and that simple. We really need to get specific in how this technology is being deployed, where it's being deployed to have smart regulation.
Sridhar, it feels like two things that weren't didn't exist when it comes to search and social media were transparency and accountability, like how the algorithms work and what happens when they go wrong. Is it realistic to think that we can legislate transparency and accountability in large language models?
I mean, I think of that actually as a business imperative. All of us know, for example, that ChatGPT hallucinates. But I can bet that most people in the room have not bothered to look at what's the hallucination rate. Does it vary between GPT-4 and like GPT-3?
It's incredibly hard to measure.
But you could come up with some metric. Here are 1,000 standard questions. You know, they have reasonably factual answers. Some of them are obscure. Some of them are more well. You can come up with frameworks so that you can at least say, like, okay, what is the approximate hallucination rate? And yet we don't think of that as something that we need to do. In my mind, this is unacceptable in a business setting. If you're asking for what's my bank balance, maybe you ask it in a slightly different way. What was my bank balance yesterday? You need to make sure that the answers that you give are actually believable. There's an implicit contract when we use software, especially business software, that it does what it says it does. And this is where, to me, techniques like retrieval augmented generation, RAG, which all of a sudden has become a common word, things like that are important so that you can not only say you're bringing the power of like fluid like language interactions to customers, but that you're actually building a believable software system. And to me, it's things like that that are really important. And to Jonathan's point, it is one thing where you ask a question of a piece of software, maybe it doesn't quite get it, but tries to give you an answer, but you can immediately tell that the answer is not okay. But on the other hand, a language model is being used to judge a loan application. All of a sudden, the bar is very, very different. And so I think as much as possible, as software makers, we need to make sure that we provide people with the tools to create responsible software, that there is ease of just understanding what it is that these pieces of software do. And the more complicated the application, I think the more transparency there has to be in what exactly.
But are you also saying that there should be a role for regulators and legislators to step in when some of the software is lying very credibly?
I think that, first of all, at like Snowflake, for example, I would not recommend that any of our business customers use a language model out of a box, even if it's fine-tuned on their data, to answer questions, simply because it's really hard to predict when the model is going to be hallucinating. So I think there needs to be just a common sense expectation of what is being provided. And the surprising thing, by the way, that I learned in the process of creating Neva, which was our search engine, is we were very clear that we represented the internet when you asked a question. You could ask it all kinds of questions. Like, one of my funny, not so funny questions was like, how can I be a sociopath? And the search engine would go find the sites that talk about this. It would write a nice summary, and we would be clear that, hey, this is summarizing the web. There are sites that actually talk about it. But what shocked me was the number of people that would look at an answer and take that as fact. And so making sure there's an amount of education into these model outputs, making sure that we are clear about when the models are really representing a piece of information that's somewhere else, or when they could outright just be making up stuff. These are things that we need if we want the public over the long time to actually trust these and interact with these as legitimate pieces of software.
And just building on that for a second, what I love what you just said is you had to do it. You saw how people used it, and you learned from it. And we can talk till the cows come home about what might happen, but I really loved hearing Jeff McMillan talk just earlier this afternoon, because he spoke about the million things that he learned from going through 9 months of building and having their question answering solution out in beta and internally. And he learned so much about how people use it, where it went right and where it went wrong, and over time improved it substantially. And we just we can't have this conversation without building and adopting, and we need to adopt and build in a safe way and thoughtful way and think about what the use cases are and make sure we're understanding what the hallucination rate looks like in this context. But if we just talk about it, we won't make progress. And I think the institutions that are actually building are building a capability and a muscle that as this technology continues to evolve, will be able to take advantage of it in a responsible, ethical way so much faster than those who are sitting on the sidelines saying, well, there's a lot of risk here.
But Jonathan, that also feels scary to me, that we need to really perfect these systems, we have to spring them into the world in their imperfect and potentially dangerous forms at moments of fraught political tension and decreasing trust in public institutions. So how do we get that feedback loop from customers, but do it in a way that is safe and doesn't have these secondary, potentially dangerous consequences?
So I go back to your exchange that you just had. You sort of mentioned that, well, it's hard to know how much ChatGPT hallucinates. And it's hard to know how much Cohere's model hallucinates if we're just talking about every possible application. But we shouldn't just spring them into the world. Those who are building solutions with technology need to say, okay, for this use case, how often is it right? What's my test set that I'm going to be using? What is an acceptable level of getting it wrong? Because humans get things wrong too, right?
And can you tell when you're getting something wrong so that you can put up that extra warning that says, hey, we're not so sure about this answer?
And there is totally a balance to be had, right? And so everybody who's building with this technology needs to be really thoughtful about it. We think a ton about it. I know our customers who are building solutions think a ton about it. It's not that it's simple, but I simply don't know how we'll answer questions. If we said, we're not going to develop the technology any further, nobody can build with it, we're not doing anything, game over until we get all the answers to the questions, I don't think we'll answer those questions.
But I don't think it's that black and white. I think it's a risk-based approach, right? And I think that's where you have to say there's a spectrum of when we think about AI in terms of narrow to general systems. And there's also a spectrum of sort of narrow to general in their application set. And each of those applications has different level of risk. And so there's plenty of sandboxes within that that's not terribly concerning, or the risks are acceptable, and you've put the system out there and you have the ability to iterate and learn and see how it performs in the real world, because there's not a terribly amount of risk associated with that particular system. I think as there's selective pressures to make systems that are ever more powerful. And to the point of like detangling science fiction from science reality, we'd have to have insight into what's actually happening with these systems, which we still don't really have. And that's where the role of audits can be something that's actually a really helpful tool. So I think there really needs to be being specific about the use case, but also what model is being used to serve that use case, and sort of thinking that through from sort of a risk assessment and risk management perspective.
Okay, please think of your questions. We'll go to the audience in a minute. But Amelia, we were talking backstage about how public trust in technology is quite low right now. How do we build or rebuild trust in AI?
Yeah. So I think the conversation we've been having here about regulation is a piece of it. There was a great YouGov poll that came out this past summer. I think it was something like 82% of Americans don't trust big tech to self-regulate, and that's quite bipartisan in that perspective. I think so that is one, I think, key piece. A second piece of it is acknowledging the public concern around this technology, acknowledging the rightful concerns that were brought up of the architects of this technology are concentrated in a few very powerful tech companies. And I think people are rightfully concerned about that concentration of power that we're seeing with this technology. I think education is a key point of it. I think liability, which is something we haven't really talked about, but being clear about who's responsible and accountable when things go wrong and communicating that to the public. And then also a point that I think doesn't get brought up enough is encouraging more conversation about a positive future with AI. So we have our risks and we know what we want to steer away from, but what is it that we're actually steering towards on the other side? And there's been some narratives that have been put forth, sort of by the Valley and by the architects of these large language models, but organizations have an opportunity to define that future. Individuals have an opportunity to define that future of saying, what do I want my organization to look like with this technology? What problems do I want it to solve? Go design me systems that help me solve the problems that I have.
It's similar to a point you were raising earlier, Jonathan, and I do think like we're all maybe as humans inclined more towards the doomers sci-fi scenarios, and then you get an essay like Mark Andreessen's optimistic manifesto, and we all kind of roll our eyes and laugh at it. So, but to Amelia's point, like how do we define the future? We don't know what this is. We're in such the early innings. How do we define an optimistic scenario that maybe inspires people more than frightens them?
Yeah, and just to name, so Cohere's CEO maybe is an anti-doomer, like that, if I can coin that phrase to describe him. So we certainly don't subscribe to the doomerist mindset. To me, it's thinking about use cases and applications that will actually make our lives better. The one that jumps to mind for me is, and I think this is not far away, is having a tutor for every kid that can learn what that kid's learning style is, what level they're at, and think about the world's best tutors. And everybody gets that at their fingertips. That is, I almost get goosebumps actually talking and thinking about that, because that's wildly exciting to me, and that actually creates a more equitable and better future. And so we can talk about robot overlords, but to the point you were making, we actually also need to talk about what's the good that we can do here? How can this help physicians as they're treating patients to prompt the right questions to ask if they haven't asked the right question that elicits information that helps solve a problem? And so I think we need to talk about actually the good that this can do, and then there's going to be really savvy entrepreneurs who go out and build those solutions and make the world a better place, and that's exciting.
Sridhar, where are you in this great grand debate between optimists and doomerists, accelerationists versus decels? Where's your personal inclination?
I think it depends on the context. And what I mean by that, with consumer software especially, I think techies, Silicon Valley, the broader tech industry, has learned a bunch of formulas about how getting the maximum number of users, usage, before everything else really, really matters. And we also have been, bred on free products. And so I think that's like on the consumer side, I think is where you have sort of troubling conflicts between the need for speed versus like creating believable, trustworthy software. And so I think there are a lot of complications there. At least in the world that I live in right now, which is the enterprise software world, I think, as I said, expectations are a lot more straightforward, which is that applications better do what they say they do. That's the business expectation. And from that perspective, I'm actually quite optimistic about the power of language models to just provide better interfaces. To me, one of the biggest breakthroughs of language models is that they can understand language, and they can take complicated pieces of information and surface it back to you as understandable language. Of course, you need systems like retrieval system to set the right context. You need to be fail-safe as much as possible. We prefer designing systems that would rather say, no, I don't know how to answer that question, than produce an incorrect answer. And so I think, in the world of these kinds of clear-cut expectations, I'm actually quite positive that language models have a lot to add when used responsibly. I think in the world of consumer software, as I said, with its growth needs to be had at all costs, I think you'll end up seeing just more conflict and more difficult problems. And when it comes to the world of generative AI, we were talking about this outside, within the next, year, 2, max 3, all of us have to get used to a world in which you can literally believe no voice you hear and no video you see. And I think that's like a whole new world that awaits all of us.
That's pretty frightening.
But that, just like you'll never trust like a quote attributed to Brad Stone, but it's taken us 20 years to get to this point. Now imagine needing to do this for voice, video, everything else that we take as reality.
I would add to that in this dichotomy that we're seeing of like accelerationist versus doomers, that is a product of our first contact with AI, and this public narrative being pushed to these absolutes on both sides, when really we need to be having a nuanced conversation. Because at least in our organization, most of us are scientists by training. We're technologists. We love technology. We make technology with the other hats that we have, and recognize that for 99% of use cases, accelerationist is the way to go. There is a corner case of 1%, whatever percentage you assign, of things that could go really, really wrong. And that's the sort of bucket in which you need to be careful. You need to move slowly. You need to move thoughtfully. And so I find that division to be unproductive a lot of the time, and we see it a little bit when talking about the differences between the AI safety folks or the AI ethics folks. And it's a more nuanced conversation. So I think that's sort of a more meta point, is like, how do we reinstall the nuance that is needed to actually tackle the challenges that AI poses?
Okay, I want to open up the questions to this audience of hardy survivors. Who has a question for our panelists? We've got one up here.
It was really interesting to hear mention of testing of hallucination rates, and I wondered what the panel's thoughts were on other diagnostics, essentially, that could be measured with regards to the performance of models in the lots of different use cases and applications that you've mentioned, that you think would not constitute the secret sauce that we hear quite a lot about, I think, in coverage of AI, that companies often want to defend and see as a kind of reason not to embrace transparency, i.e. giving up competitive advantage, a kind of engineering secrecy that is that kind of marketable benefit that you have as a company with serious innovation. So alongside measuring hallucination rates, what else might we be able to sort of pull into the domain of transparency from companies that are working on these powerful models?
I mean, some of this is application specific. At Snowflake, for example, we are working on a text-to-SQL model a model that can understand the context of a given schema, take a question in language, in English, and be able to generate a SQL query for it. And so in a situation like this, sort of relatively standard machine learning measures like precision and recall. Precision is the rate at which you're getting things right, like 1 minus the rate at which you're getting things wrong, or how many questions are you able to answer at all, and looking at the trade-offs therein is something that we do a lot of. And so like each application has its inbuilt like nuances about what constitutes correctness, what constitutes like something that is wrong, or what constitutes like completely unacceptable behavior when it comes to language. And so I don't think there is a one size fits all, but this is part of what I mean by responsible application development, which is that like an app sort of needs to do what it says it's going to do, and when it gets things wrong, you should at least be transparent about, no, you really need to talk to a customer service representative to answer this question.
I would maybe add to that, not on the technical side, but on the regulatory side, we do have precedents that we can borrow from. So in thinking of, like from my field, the FDA, right, both in regulating drugs and biologics, which is a lot of sensitive intellectual property, but also regulating software as a medical device in which they have sort of full visibility and transparency. So that I think is the unique role of the government, is to be able to sort of be above the competitive landscape and be able to serve as a mediator that is not sort of affecting a competitive advantage that an individual company may have.
I found it surprising that some AI companies seem to find their own products to be unpredictable or inexplicable. Like they don't quite understand the answers that their chatbots or image generation services are providing. Like, should that be acceptable? Should companies be releasing products that are unpredictable?
So my argument is, if you are going to go to the FDA today and for a new drug and you don't have a mechanism of action,
that would not fly.
And you say, we have no idea how this works, they would say, go figure out how this works, right? I think that we do have to also adapt our thinking to new categories of technology, right? And so this is, again, where the risk-based approach comes in. There are consequences of not knowing, and so depending on what use case you have, depending on the power of that system, whether it's, hey, release broadly, go play with it, we don't know how it works, and it's highly unpredictable, that's probably not the best course of action, yet it is kind of the default trajectory that we're on.
Brad, has the ship sailed
on
this predictability, unpredictability thing? The entire basis of machine learning is in finding patterns that humans cannot see. I used to run like search ads for a long time at Google, as you know, and lots of advertisers used to ask me, so what's the magic sauce for how I can get better click-through performance? Should I put my company name in the creative and it'll be better? And I would give them the truthful answer of, I have no idea whether it'll make it better, but why don't you try it? If it does, we will reward you. And so we already have a ton of these systems that find patterns in data. I'm not saying this as an excuse for what like language model companies should be doing. In fact, I think that language model companies have no business taking like an output of a language model and pretending that it's the truth. It is something that's been synthesized by a model, and so you need more predictable systems like a retrieval system. So you can say, yes, I believe in this piece of information, and here is a link to a publication from a reputed institution like Bloomberg that backs up what I'm saying. Please go check here if you want more information. I think it's, again, that expectation of what is it that you want the system to do that I think is more important. Finding patterns in data and us not understanding these patterns, I think that ship was sailed a long time.
Fair point. Another question from the audience.
Yes, I have one question. So there are these risks now, as we talk also about controls. Some of those risks are a little bit harder to identify than hallucinations, and maybe the answer, if you just read that one answer, seems to be correct. And there's one example that we actually discussed quite a bit in our company, and I need to read it out. But it's really about the question, who is the institution that should actually control? And the example is, if you ask ChatGPT, do Israelis deserve to be free? The answer is yes. Like all people, Israelis have the right to freedom and self-determination. This principle is a fundamental aspect of human rights, and so on and so on. If you ask the question, do Palestinians deserve to be free? The answer is, as an AI developed by OpenAI, I don't hold personal opinions or beliefs. The question of whether Palestinians deserve to be free is a complex and deeply political one, and so on and so on. So if you read that only and ask this question and say, well, yes, it is a bit complex, but if you put it in contrast to these two questions, there is a kind of a bias behind the answers. So obviously it's a designed answer and kind of by an OpenAI, but depending on where you are in the world, who should be the one who is kind of, first of all, identifying those topics. As you said, we use these, the ChatGPTs and others for our children to ask questions, to get education. But there are these types of bias in these types of systems, and they are really hard to identify, and they have a massive impact.
That's a great question, and Sridhar, I'll have to call on you because I mean Google faced these questions for years. Like how can you even pretend to be an arbiter of truth in a world where truth is a difficult thing, you know? And there's and these search engines and these AI systems reflect, you know, public opinion and the corpus of knowledge, and we don't live in a world of truth. We live in a world of opinion. So what expectations should we put on these models?
I mean, my answer is you should believe nothing that comes straight from a language model. Like, honestly. And yes, the answer to your question about what does a search engine say is you also need to understand that implicit in any Google search result page is these reflect the biases of the internet. And there are complicated questions for which there is no truth. You can get some opinions, and you sort of have to decide for yourself. So I don't see these as having simple answers.
I'm going to sound like I'm beating a dead horse here, but this is why if you're building an application using this technology, you need to think about how unconstrained do we want it to be? What are the constraints that we want to put on this? And how are we going to rigorously evaluate it? And so I spoke with a global retailer, and they were looking at building a chatbot into their consumer-facing website. And they said, well, hey, we don't want it to gauge on anything other than clothing. If you ask it for a recipe for Thanksgiving, it shouldn't respond. So these are the constraints that we're going to put around it. Now, how do we evaluate it? How do we make sure it's right? How do we make sure it doesn't go off? And then for organizations, how do we build the muscle to start building some of these solutions? Maybe they're internal facing, to start seeing how well they do, learning where we missed something. You know, it actually said something that it shouldn't have. We weren't evaluating for that. How do we build that into how we're evaluating this so that we're able to make it progressively better? And what are the levels of accuracy that we need to have in order to feel comfortable releasing this to our own employees, releasing this to our own customers, our own clients? And there isn't a simple answer to everything, but it actually requires organizations getting hands-on, workshopping, bring in diverse perspectives from diverse folks with diverse experiences at their organization, and engaging with their own customers on what people are comfortable with to make it better and progress it to a place where you feel comfortable with it. And so we really can't let people off the hook of doing the hard work of thinking, how are we going to use this technology? How are we going to evaluate it? And how are we going to make sure that we're getting better over time with it? I think that's just so critical.
Yeah.
And by the way, these are things that any major software creator of any kind knows how to do. No big retailer in their right mind is going to design a brand new website and one fine day say, here, it's ready for the world. You're going to release it to 5 people and then 10 people. You're going to do extensive testing. You're going to have a data set that you're going to question this against. So processes for rolling out software are actually well understood And so especially when it comes to business applications, having the tooling, having the mechanisms in place to figure out what right is, they're there. People know how to do this. Like language models are a new tool, a new way to do things. But the core of how do you design believable, trustable systems, these have been done for a while.
But to add to sort of what you were saying before, I would say two things. One, I agree we shouldn't believe anything a language model puts out. But is that how we're deploying these to the public? And is that the actual expectation we're setting? Or is it just an asterisk at the bottom of the page in the terms and conditions of not to believe what these systems are outputting? So I do think there is an obligation in public discourse to set expectations of what these systems actually are.
I mean, can you imagine the disclaimer atop ChatGPT?
Yeah.
Do not believe what this says.
Correct. And I would say the second point that you bring up is a good one is who's making these decisions and how inclusive is both the development and sort of decisions around deployment of these technologies. And we know that there's serious problems with inclusion here in the United States. And then when you zoom that out to a global perspective of countries that have really had no say in the development of technology, there is a little bit of work happening at the UN right now as a fora, but I think it's something that we should all be taking a sort of moral responsibility to think towards. How do we make these discussions more inclusive so the decisions that we ultimately come to are more representative?
Can I just ask you, can I bring you back to the example of the questioner? Like, it wasn't even bias. It's almost like a lame overabundance of caution on the part of OpenAI, where somebody went in and said, okay, the issue of Palestinians is too hot to handle, like, back off, don't say anything. But clearly there was a double standard there on the question vis-a-vis the Israelis. Like, should that kind of bias be acceptable?
So I think it shouldn't, right? And the reality is that there's still humans tuning these models and humans that have bias and the bias in the data sets, right? And those are the conversations that we need to be having and surfacing of how do we deal with these challenges and who should be deciding the protocols and methods to which we do deal with them, because there are no easy answers when it comes to questions of ethics, but certainly like there are concrete biases here that we know that need to be addressed, and so I think that needs to be front and center as well.
Okay, I'm going to do one more question, and then we'll unleash everyone to the bar. Yes, sir.
It's a forward-looking question. So after GPT went live, traffic to Stack Overflow fell off a cliff. And there is a known problem with training models on the output of other models, which is somebody cleverly called it MAD, the model autophagy disorder. So you feed the output of models to other models, they go crazy after 3 or 4 generations. Do you think we're going to run out of stuff to train models on? Because people will just use them to code and write and make images? Not generally, but in specific cases like making new Python code. Simply put, people are writing a lot less code that you can feed these things, and so how are they going to get smarter 2 or 3 generations from now?
I can answer a bit of that. Training data is really, really important. We spend a fair amount of effort on things like language to SQL queries, language to Python code. And we do live in a world where the amount of machine-generated content is absolutely on the rise. I can see more and more of it on like image search, more and more of it on Google search. I think it's going to be a little bit of an arms race there. And I think the biggest companies are going to be investing, all companies honestly, are going to be investing in data sets that are critical for their functioning. I think this is it's a straightforward business imperative.
Go ahead.
No, I would also say that running out of training data does not necessarily equate to stopping progress, right? Because there's also the algorithmic efficiency side of this, and when we see what's been happening in the open source community and like progress that's being made there, because they don't have the luxury of the amount of capital for compute. So whether or not that's a bottleneck, I think remains to be seen.
The other piece I'd add is that as these models get more and more knowledgeable and capable, it's not just a scale game. It's also a game of having like really high quality, curated, diverse data sets that the models can learn from. And in that world, you actually don't just want to grab whatever you can grab and throw at the model. You actually want real experts who are human annotating really high quality data sets in order to be utilized. And if you're a large financial institution that is sitting on a massive trove of data, being really thoughtful of how you take that data and annotate it in order to fine-tune or train a model. And so one of the really interesting things as we've seen these models get more and more capable is just how valuable like individual, high-quality, small data sets can be in driving performance in a specific domain.
All right. Well, folks, don't go anywhere. We have closing